Welcome back. Now, since the start of this year, Islamist militants have mounted a series of shootings and bombings in Kenya. The targets have ranged from market stalls and buses to restaurants and a beach resort. The recent June 15th attack in Kenya's coastal town of Lamu, where more than 60 people were killed, is perhaps the deadliest attack in Kenya since the Westgate Mall siege in September 2013. And in the wake of the Mpeketoni attack, there are unconfirmed reports that Muslims are being targeted for arrest on suspicion of being behind these attacks. So tonight on Talk of the Nation, I am joined by Law Don Dr. Businje Kabumba to discuss the growing threat of terror in the region and the intersection with human rights. Good evening, Dr. Businje.
Good evening, Shana.
Welcome to Talk of the Nation.
Thank you.
We'll get right into the discussion. There have been reports of increasing detentions and extrajudicial execution of Muslim clerics in Kenya as suspects in the terror attacks. What does this mean in terms of the possibility of radicalizing some elements within the targeted communities?
Yeah, it's interesting you should mention that. The cyclical nature, the reverse nature between terrorism and human rights. A lot of time this is not surfaced. The idea always is about finding a balance between terrorism, effective security measures, and human rights. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize, number one, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Just not too long ago, Nelson Mandela was on a list of terrorists kept by the United Nations and the United States. So it's always a fine line deciding. It's a political question deciding who is a terrorist, who is a freedom fighter, and these are not always clear. But secondly, and more importantly, the fact that your response to terrorism might determine whether it happens again. And often, also, terrorism is created by certain human rights violations, denials of political freedoms, denials of human rights, etc. So there's this reflexive relationship that is not always acknowledged.
One of the principles that should be considered from a legal policy perspective in the fight against terrorism is respect for human rights and the rule of law, obviously. But we also know that counterterrorism can result in innocent people being targeted or victimized in the name of the state being seen to take action. How do we strike a balance?
A very important question. In the first place, we start from the human rights perspective, that in our constitution, for instance, you have a whole chapter for human rights. But at the same time, and I'm reminded of a statement by Justice Jackson in Taminiello versus Chicago in 1948 U.S. case, where he said, the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact. We don't hang ourselves under the shrine of human rights. That necessarily there must be certain accommodations that balance human rights and security. And our Constitution has tried to do that. Article 46 in particular, very interestingly says that certain measures taken in human rights in terms of a state of emergency shall not be taken to be inconsistent with the Chapter 4 Bill of Rights if they are reasonably justifiable in the sense of furthering or, putting into effect the state of emergency. And that standard is extremely lower, markedly lower than that of general human rights limitation under the Constitution, because Article 43 talks about that a measure must be acceptable and demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. Now, so when we're in a peacetime, in normal situations, the standard is a very high one: acceptability, demonstrable justifiability. But in a state of emergency declared under Article 110, it's a lower standard, reasonably justifiable, as low as that. And I think it goes to the idea of the human rights not being a suicide pact, that we have to trust the state to keep us safe. And in that regard, we give them a higher measure of deference in regard to such measures.
It's interesting that you talk about trusting the state to keep us safe, because in criminal law, punishment for a crime serves two purposes, essentially: to punish or correct and to deter guilty offenders, but also to provide society with a sense of justice. So when we're talking about terrorism, which purpose should we pursue when dealing with terrorists?
I think we should keep in mind both purposes. The Constitution tries to balance that, to say, well, the president can declare a state of emergency if there's the threat of the nation, the life of the nation is threatened. So we have human rights on the one hand, but at the same time we have certainly we're giving the executive to place in effect positive measures to guide our security. But at the same time, I just want to also surface the disconnect in a sense between constitutional text and reality. And I'll just give about 2 or 3 examples. March 2007, here in Uganda, 6 PRA suspects were released by the court on bail, and immediately the army surrounded the High Court and refused to let them out because the government felt you're letting out people who are going to endanger the state. A clear example, Barack Obama in 2008 said, in my first 100 days, I'm going to close Guantanamo Bay. 5 years later, he hasn't done so because it said you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. As a commander-in-chief, he must have looked at the scenarios and decided, for better or for worse, they had to take certain steps that, the question of torture, we always say it's a jus cogens norm, it cannot be derogated from. The fact of the matter is, many countries, including Uganda, including the United States, still keep safe houses and other dubious forms. So in a sense, you have rhetoric, you have the ideals, but you also have this troubling reality that somehow we have very hard choices that have been made. I'll just give you one last example, and one I think that brings to the question about, for instance, the people in Kenya of Somali origin or Muslims. In 1944, at the height of the World War, Japanese Americans were interned, all of them, 110,000, simply because the US was at war with Japan and they felt that these were going to be potential spies. It was brought for the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus the Attorney General, and in a 6-3 decision, the court decided that was fine, it was constitutional to keep 110,000 people in internment camps rather than let them. Now, it was a markedly political decision in a sense, but the court also recognizing that, in terms of war, inter arma legacy land, in the time of war, the law is silent. Okay. And it's interesting, 2014, just fast forward 2014, a very conservative judge, Antonin Scalia, has acknowledged that it was a wrong decision, but has said that in a wartime, courts will probably do the same thing. So it's easy to second guess from sort of an academic perspective, sit back and say, you did wrong, etc. But the fact of the matter is, when security is threatened, most often than not, you'll find all of us, including yourself and myself, retreating and trying to let the state take a forward seat.
Okay, let's come closer home. 4 years since the July 11th attacks in Kampala.
Yeah.
Suspects are still in detention.
Yeah.
As the question of jurisdiction over where the trial should happen remains unsolved.
Yeah.
Is this not symptomatic of the sacrifice of human rights at the altar of peace?
I think it is, but it also, I think also explains the dilemma that states find themselves in. Another example is Kwoyelo, someone who is accused of war crimes, high crimes, and was granted, is supposed apparently to be granted amnesty under the Act, but the state basically says we can't let this person get out. So in a sense, there's always going to be this balance. It's almost historical, it's time immemorial, the balance between human rights and security. But the sense seems to be that in certain limited circumstances, security is prided over human rights. That Article 4 of the ICCPR, for instance, makes the same point. Although, then, of course, the idea is that certain human rights, even in that circumstance, cannot be derogated from. Article 44 of our Constitution says, notwithstanding anything in the Constitution, including the sense of emergency, you cannot remove the right of slavery, the question of fair trial, habeas corpus, and torture. But the fact of the matter is, these are the first things that go in a state of emergency, in the time of war. They're the first thing that go. People are routinely tortured. I'll just give you one example, perhaps, to personalize the question and make it real. Assume you had a terrorist who, in 5 minutes, is going to blow up the taxi park and 1,000 people are going to go. Okay. Would you torture that person to save the 1,000 people? You have 5 minutes.
Would I torture the person?
Yes.
Certainly.
And torture, yeah, thank you.
I wouldn't even think about it.
So you see, this is the famous ticking bomb scenario of Professor Dershowitz of Harvard Law School. It says, that somehow as legal people we need to sort of calm down and strike a finer balance between human rights and security. Of course,
but it sounds like that we can't even be talking about striking a balance between human rights and counterterrorism. Yeah. So maybe it's not realistic to try and find a balance at all.
It is, and perhaps it's also related to the question of the legal fictions that maybe we maintain the protections. We maintain the constitutional protections and safeguard them as much as we can. But I think we also have to be a little bit conscious of the fact that in some of the darkest times, the grayest areas, certain difficult decisions will have to be made by people who are normally like us, who have the same sincerity like us, but will have to do very tough things to keep us safe. This is not countenance, torture and all these other things, but just to say that the reality of security might call for difficult choices that are often made by people who are in those places and are trusted by us to do those choices.
And on that note, we'll bring this conversation to a close because our time is first spent. Right. That was Constitutional Law Don, Dr. Businja Kabumba, joining me to discuss the intersection between the intersection between counterterrorism and human rights.